Welcome, everyone. We're so glad you could join us for this question and response session with James Finley. Before we get started, I thought it might be helpful just to take a minute, and if you have any questions you'd like to pop in the Q&A section right next to or below the video you're seeing me in. And what's also helpful is if you can review the existing questions and vote up any that you would like an answer to, and that will just help us surface the ones that are going to support this community the most. And so we'll just take a minute for that to happen. Wonderful. Thank you so much for doing that. That helps everyone who's here. So as you know, you can both enter your own questions or like other questions that pushes them towards the top of the queue, and hopefully we're getting questions that will benefit the majority of the community here. So, and thank you again for being here. I'm going to welcome Jim Finley to join me.
Glad to be here.
Hi, Jim. Great to see you.
Yes.
We've got a crowd of people with some wonderful questions for you today, but I wanted to just give you a chance to make an opening statement.
No, I guess my only statement would be I watched my presentation this morning along with everybody else, and I felt it had flow to it. I felt it was I was conveying what my heart moved me to try to share and convey. It felt authentic to me and real. So just that I was grateful that could happen, and we could all be together in that way. I'm grateful for that. Yeah.
Wonderful. And it looks so beautiful in that chapel.
Yeah, it's lovely.
Special place.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah. Okay, you ready to get started?
I am.
So our first question is from Victoria. How can we hold the pain and suffering of the whole world in our contemplation without being overwhelmed?
Yes. Yeah, see, this is really the practical question, because sometimes, let's say we're in a traumatized state. How can we hold our own suffering without being overwhelmed? Or if there's a loved one who's going under and we can't save them. So out of our very love that moves us to hold the suffering, we realize that it tests the limits of our suffering. And so we owe it to others, to ourselves, and to the world to take care of ourselves, because we're just a human being. We're just a human being. And so what we do is, I think we back off, and let's say, be different ways of doing this, knowing that the infinite, that the love of God is infinitely greater than the sum total of all the suffering in the world, as terrible as it might be. And that we want to be present to it, that is sensitive to it in our intention, that we care, Our heart goes out and we care. So there's like a prayerful kind of inclusion and kind of empathy with the suffering. But we're always pacing it and our ability to stay spiritually grounded in the presence to the suffering. And when it's a little too much, we back off, get regrounded, come back. And so it's a very personal thing how we kind of maintain that art form of that sensitivity. Because we should feel energized. I mean, we should feel alive, and we should feel like we can lean into it. Grounded in a peace that's not dependent on the outcome of the effort, because it's the peace of God that sustains all of us. And so that's where it kind of touches spiritual direction and insight and things like that, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Jim, can you repeat that phrase you said at the beginning? It was so beautiful, something about the amount of suffering versus infinite love.
Oh, yes. Is that the suffering of the world is overwhelming. And so what we do, which is the practice, the prayer, the faith, is we renew in our heart the awareness that God's love is infinitely greater than the suffering of the world. And that's what I mean too when I say that God is a presence that protects us from nothing, even as God unexplainably sustains us in all things. So we are sustained, but we're sustained unexplainably by the love that loves us so in the midst of the unresolved matters of the world. And so it's grounded in that faith that we face the suffering situation. Because unless we're grounded in that faith, our peace is dependent on our ability to overcome it, our ability to solve it, our ability to, and therefore we're back into anxiety again. Yeah. But if we're grounded in a love that instructs us to pace our tolerance level, to keep leaning into the suffering, to do love's work, then I think that's the essence of ministry, or the corporal works of mercy, or just the art of compassion, I guess.
Beautiful. So God's love is infinitely greater than, I think you said, the sum total of all the suffering. That would be throughout history, right? Not just
throughout the whole. That's the mystery of exactly. There's another way I put it sometimes, is that when we look at life and just accept what life's really like, we realize that there is no place so pure or so innocent or so safe that the cruel or the unfair or the destructive might not find us and bring us down. That's really true. See? Traumatized children know that. Refugees know that. All people know that. And this would make us go crazy inside if we didn't know that the suffering of the world has no refuge from the love that utterly transcends it and permeates it through and through and through and through and through. So it shows up in hospice units, it shows up in hospitals, it shows up, in homes, it shows up in the quiet hour. It's Christ consciousness, really. I think it's how Christ walked the streets of the world. Yeah.
Thank you, Jim. Beautiful. A question from Chris. How do I love people who do evil things?
I think that I want to say it in principle first, and then in reality. In principle, we realize in faith that God's infinite love for a person is in no way whatever limited or diminished by the terrible things a person might do. And we have no power to stop God being infinitely in love with us in our brokenness. So no matter how terrible it is. Next, what we can do and should do is hate the hateful thing the person did because of the suffering it causes. And we can also then be sensitive to the different levels in the social order and the legal system and systems and so on, of one preventative medicine, like preventative parenting. How do we nurture and protect that God depends on us to be the merciful presence in the world? And so how do we practice first nonviolence, to be a nonviolent, nurturing person? And then when suffering does occur, how can we do our best not to be part of it? And when those who are victimized by suffering, how can we do our best to, one, protect society from those people, to get them the help they need, and so on. So it's things like that in general. It gets more personal when the hateful thing the person did was, kill your spouse.
Yeah.
Or what they did is they got you fired. You can't get your job back, and they lied. Or you lost your home because they did. Then that's where I think it's just understandable to feel anger towards them.
Mm-hmm.
Not that you'd wish them harm. In your worst moments, you might wish them harm.
Mm-hmm.
But in your heart, you don't wish them harm. But I think it's very healthy to feel real anger toward a person who deliberately hurt you in a destructive way. That's why I say anger is one of the resources I used to use. Anger is the God-given emotion that restores the boundary that was violated. So anger is not revenge. Anger is not violent. Anger is not. But until you can do your best to set the boundary, and you set the boundary, sensing at the feeling level what a terrible thing that person did to you. It's not in the abstract. It's that person. I think those are normal feelings. Mm-hmm. And we just, work with them as best we can. Because I think
anger's not.
Yeah. So, because the thing is, until you've gotten angry and set the boundary, the unacknowledged anger will leak out sideways as passive-aggressive behavior, self-loathing, and so on. But once you've owned the anger, and then you don't forgive them in the anger, you're still a prisoner of it. See, it's owning the anger, and it's real anger, but it really allows you then to forgive the person. I wish you no harm. See, it's kind of like that, I think.
Yeah, well, so anger's not the opposite of love. It's a healthy reaction, but we can't stay there.
Yeah, exactly. It's a component of love.
Yeah.
That when we say when we love somebody very much, say it's like a child, and the child was victimized, as a dimension of our love for the child, we're angry at the perpetrator.
Yeah.
So really that thing, but that's different than revenge. That's different than hate. That's different than, and it can spill over into that. We need to watch because the pain gets so intense.
Yeah.
We just have to know that we stay, it's like a grounded anger. And we use the anger to be effective, to guide us for boundary setting and restoration. And easier said than done. But in therapy situations in life, these are the realities we sort out, as best we can.
Yeah, that's really helpful to hear, Jim. Thank you for sharing that. A question from Robert. Jim, for you, what does union with God mean at the dimension of consciousness, the heart dimension, and the practical life dimension?
Well, again, it's an attempt to put words to it. To me, my I guess one way what it means to me is that it's kind of a very quiet inner clarity in which God and I mutually disappear as dualistically other than each other. It's that. It's just like oneness in all directions. That's why I love that quote by Romano Guardini. Although I am not God, I'm not other than God either. And although I'm not any of you, I'm not other than any of you either. Although I'm not the earth, I'm not other than the earth either. And so when we hear it, we hear the poetic beauty of it, like it rings true. But I think the actual experience of union is realizing we are that. That when Jesus said, I came that you might have life and have it more abundantly, the life is the life that is at once God's and our own. Intimately realized as a state, as a unitive state, consciousness. Then when the purity of that oneness dissipates, there's like the hallowed sensitivity to it. At least like an aura of oneness behind it, looking at the ocean or smelling a flower or the face of the friend, or whatever, like that. And then that aura further perpetuates into underlying attitudes of respect and reverence and sensitivity, and it seeks to become more and more habituated. And so that somehow the day-by-day ordinary experience is intimately realized to be God, giving herself and living herself out in the patterns and rhythms of our ordinary experience, which renders it holy. And it's like that. To me, that's what it's like.
Thank you, Jim. A question from Heather. I remember in the Living School, I was so touched by you talking about the mystery of dementia, how someone with dementia is in some precious way bearing witness to an aspect of reality on our behalf. Both my mother and grandmother suffered with dementia. Would you speak a little about this, please?
Yes, Heather, yes. In the Living School, it's amazing. I look back when I was younger, these things I blissfully said, and all of a sudden they come true in your own life. It's a different story. So I relate because I've shared this with my wife. Maureen died over a year ago of dementia right out here in the living room. Her ashes are out there. And so I sat with her and watched that happen live. And so what to me what it meant was this. One, it's a horrible disease. I mean, consciousness is such a gift. Seriously, when you literally watch a person melting away this way, where they don't know what day it is or where they live, and they're, jumping off the railing of the porch. It's a horrible disease. It just really is. And so we need to acknowledge it and give them good care and protect them. And also, the doctor told me, unless I got help, an in-house nurse to help me, I might die before her. That a lot of times the caretaker dies before the dementia patient because you're vigilant 24 hours a day, And then at the same time, the other side of it is, for me, I think this is the other side of it is, it reminds me, we say it, but it really makes it true, that the inner beauty of the person that the eyes of love see is not dependent on that person's ability to express that beauty. So their ability to express it starts dwindling down to the 0 point. But when they're lying there and they look you in the face, you don't know who you are anymore. There's a certain kind of divine beauty that shines out in their inability to know. And then it says something very real about all of us, too, because we tend to equate ourselves with our powers. We tend to equate ourselves. But what is it that even as all my powers diminish, does not diminish? And the eyes of love sees it. And I think it's God. I think that's God shining out like that. So it's a very mysterious thing. So it's a painful thing. It's a hard thing. But to me, these kind of insights I shared now really help me to, the more I think about it here, it's become a very kind of gentle thing about the mystery of presence. So now I sense her presence is still here. And so the presence is not dependent on the ability to manifest the presence. And it's hidden. That's why in the depths of our heart, in the depths of silence, in the depths of, we get in touch with this presence. There's really the presence of God presencing itself is our presence, not dependent on the ability to express it, because it's not dependent on anything at all. This is what makes death trustworthy. If God is Lord of life, God is Lord of death. God's the infinity of life and God's the infinity of death. What's the divinity of diminishment? That's what we're talking about. And this infinite love shines bright in diminishment, deeply understood. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that, Jim. Question from Jason. I want to be more intentional in going deeper in the path of the mystics after this conference and not let it be forgotten in the busyness of life. Any suggestions on steps to take to go deeper? Can you elaborate on the practice you mentioned being faithful to?
Yeah, I have a suggestion. That there's a podcast to the mystics. Kirsten and I walk together through the mystics. So we've did Thomas Merton, And we did Teresa of Avila, Trier Castle. We did St. John of the Cross. We're going to do Ladder Amongst Next with a Cloud of Unknowing. So they're 30-minute things where you can write in questions and there's a dialogue. So it's a little bite-sized pieces to be used for meditation and prayer. And then it's offering guidance in reading the mystics that offer guidance. And so I would suggest that you find an accessible point of entry into the mystic way. And then you practice it, and you're like, practice your practice and practice it. Then you're like talking about, and you sit with, you concretize it. And the mystics offer guidance in that, and understanding what happens to you when you sit that way with all your heart. See, how to be faithful to that. And what are the teachings that offer that? And then the path, because they help us understand this. It's hard to believe that such things actually pertain to you. See, and all of a sudden you realize they do pertain to me because they touch my heart. I touch my heart. And so although it touches my heart, what's it asking out of me? See, how do I respond to that? And so what you find in the mystics is kind of contemplative spiritual direction. You find very quiet, insightful, reassuring guidance in this path as you choose to live it in the world. So those would be my thoughts.
Yeah. And what's lovely about the podcast is it's free.
Yes.
And it's a guided Lectio practice by you. So it's an actual guided meditation practice. You ring the bell and have some silence at the end, and it's a beautiful teaching on a mystic. So
and what's a gift to me is it's the way I teach. Like I did think I used to travel around the country doing this on silent weekend retreats. Meals were in silence. And so now for me, providentially, to be able to teach from my home this way, and writing questions, we have dialogues. So there's some ongoing, heartfelt way people can just walk along with it at their own pace, And little by little, sometimes you'll find a mystic that particularly resonates with you. And you can read it and walk with that person and take it, become intimate, let that mystic's presence become intimate to you and guide you. So these teachings they're very beautiful, but they're not easy. And they're not difficult because they're theoretical. They're difficult because we're not used to such intimacy. That's what makes it difficult. We're not used to something where we're invited to a sustained stance of attentiveness infused with childlike love and stay there, and see where it takes you, that kind of thing. And that's why I think we need encouragement and help to find our way and so on. Also, if locally you can find a centering prayer group or contemplative prayer group, whatever is it practices, that can be helpful too if you can find it.
Yeah. Would you say, Jim, just back to that question on union, we're not used to the language of union. We're not used to how that is offered and how to let the language of union create states of union in us.
That's right. Exactly. So, but when you read it, so for example, if you're tuned to it, so for example, when we did Teresa together, or Mirabai today did a beautiful thing on Teresa and Mirabai, so in the fourth mansion, she's talking about sitting in prayer, which is the beginning of the mystical, contemplative. And she says, as you're sitting there in silence, you begin to realize your heart's being enlarged to divine proportions. And she says it's like water flowing into you, not from afar through effort, like through thing, but it's welling up from some hidden place inside of you. And it's transforming you into itself. And so your prayer is to surrender to that. Like your prayer is to just stay there. And so she says there's a kind of a precision to it that when you read it, you say, you know what, I've had moments like that. I could feel, and sometimes when we begin to feel it, we back away. I think because we're afraid to lose the control that we think that we have over the life that we think that we're living. And the closer we get to it's happening, we go, oh my God, if I'm not careful, I'll find what I'm looking for. And we back off, take notes or something, I don't know, some damn thing. And so it takes, I think it takes childlike sincerity. It takes courage and humility. And you just kind of just stay with it. Ask God to help you and stay with it. But the very desire for it is already the sign that it's already happening. But it's happening in you as the desire for it. That's how it starts, really. Yeah.
Just one last thing. I think it was Jason was asking about a daily practice. And Jim, I've heard you say, find the practice that takes you to the deeper place, which might not be contemplative prayer. Yeah. It might be, I think you've offered things like gardening or going
exactly.
by the ocean or
Yeah. The thing is, though, whatever, like for me right now, I guess my practice, my writing, is I write 6 hours a day, longhand. And long silences in between. Sometimes writing one paragraph 30 times, whatever. But the thing is, you find that act, which when you give yourself over to it with your whole heart, it takes you to the deeper place. And I think that's the thing.
Yeah.
It's with your whole heart. It's not in passing on the way to something else. And you don't know what it is, but whatever that is, you give yourself over to that. You can feel yourself moving down into a more inclusive, generous, expansive, subtle, delicate, And if you're faithful to your practice will be faithful to you, Ida Roshi says. And then that practice time starts becoming habituated through the day, contemplative character transformation, little by little by little, it kind of carries you along.
Thanks, Jim. And you'll actually be leading a closing practice today for the conference. So that'll be nice.
Yes, I will. I will,
the steps you take in practice. Yeah. Okay, Victoria asks, how can we learn resistance to the triggers that would plunge us back into a re-experiencing of trauma?
Yes. Let's say that you have a history of trauma. Let's say it still can get triggered. And let's say, it depends, it's a deep therapy question, really. It depends on where you are with this. Just to know that you can still be at a place where once it gets triggered, it's triggered. It isn't like it politely introduces itself down the road, like, here I come, get ready. Like all of a sudden, you don't see it coming. A sudden burst, someone's angry or someone made different things trigger. It depends on what it is. Depends on how you were traumatized. And so what you do first, here's what I find helpful, what I say to people in therapy. I found this helpful too. You first know what your triggers are. It could be in the area of sexuality. It could be in the area of anger. It could be in the area of abandonment. It could be in the area of the fear of failure. It could be deep toxic shame feelings about yourself. So you learn what are the kinds of people, the kinds of events and kinds of circumstances that trigger my trauma. Next, you rehearse it before it happens. So you role play it. So let's say it's anger, an authority figure is angry. So what you do is you practice it. You practice it. Some ways to practice it, for example, would be, see, there's the adult you that knows that essentially you're equal to this person, just a human being. But there's the traumatized childlike part that doesn't know that. And so the adult you with God's grace lets the childlike part of you know. Lets that know, I take that on. I see you, dear one, and I'm here for you. And I will not let anyone hurt you. I will not be passive and let anyone treat you in a way you do not deserve to be treated. I got my eye out on you like this. Then as the adult, you know that when you start to get triggered, the trouble is you turn into the traumatized part. See? And so you have to keep asking God for the strength to get stronger, wrap yourself in white light. There's visualization work you can do, different things you can do to internalize these patterns. And with practice, it doesn't happen right away, but in consistency, in sincerely practicing things like this. And if you're in therapy, you can find a therapist who works with trauma, who helps people with things like this. You can heal. You know what I mean? It's the healing is real. But those would be some thoughts. Those would be some thoughts. A trauma survivor, I think, a person on the journey needs to give themselves permission to be where they are on the journey for now.
Yeah.
I'm not where I used to be. I'm not yet where I want to be, but I am right here. And I can practice certain things that can help me move further along the path toward wholeness. I can do that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jim. This is a question from Michelle. Recently, I took your online class with Mirabai Starr on St. Teresa of Avila, and I would love to learn more from you. Once we are able to gather in person, do you offer weekend or week-long retreats?
I hope to. I was hoping that the pandemic is going to lighten up. You know, I can't wear a mask. I'm kind of claustrophobic. I have trouble with a mask. And so I was hoping there'd be flights where it'd be like if you were vaccinated, you didn't have to wear a mask. I don't want to get back to where I was for years. Every other weekend I was somewhere, United States or Canada, I went to Europe. I'm not going to do that again. But I think I would like to do some live things again. They'd be posted on my website, jamesfinley.org. And you'd see my schedule there. And if that starts to happen, you'll see that. I think right now I'm scheduled to do one in Florida in February. And so right now I'm depending on like Zoom retreats. People are hosting me on different podcasts. And again, if you go on my website, you'll see that. Or also if you go to YouTube and put in James Finley videos, you'll see tons of pirated videos of me. I don't post people. You'll see all kinds of talks all over the place. Like, where do these things come from? And so sometimes you can, because there's something about it, if you see the voice and see the person, there's like a presence to it. It's not the same. But I do hope to do that. Locally here too at St. Monica's, I hope to reinstate.
Yeah.
So keep an eye out. We'll see what happens here.
Yeah. Thanks, Jim. And we host your website at cac.org, but I think if you type in jamesfinley.org, it'll take you there as well.
Both ways, yeah, that's right. Both ways.
Yeah. Okay. From Julia. I seem to have lost the ability to cry, the gift of tears. On 2 occasions, my stored up tears have been awakened by a scene in Il Postino, the film about Pablo Neruda and the postman. Is there any way back to tears for me?
Yeah, I love that movie, by the way. It's a very touching movie. Got to me too. Oh, it's a great movie. Well, first of all, I want to stay with her on the example that she's using. Because, see, one thing is, first of all, be a matter of having to do a dialogue first. How long has it been since you've not been able to cry? And did you used to be able to? And how do you understand what happened? Understand what happened? And it's also true that there's a part of you, by stopping you from crying, it believes it's taking care of you. See? It's actually a defense or protective, but it's overstating its case. So you would try to figure out what that belief is about not crying. Also, the very fact you can't cry and want to cry, you're already interiorly crying, in a way, when you think about it. There's something poignant about that, something touching. And then the postman is a good example, because what you do is you look at, novels can do this, or certain poets can do this. You go to the places that get to you. And what's interesting, for me lately, for some reason, with Tolkien, Lord of the Rings, and especially I tied into my own life and trauma and death and everything. And something is so aesthetically touching. You know what I mean? It's something so, and you can. It's not repetition is not redundant. And then you can expand your repertoire. If I can cry at the movie The Postman, then I can say, but what is it the postman's about that makes me cry?
Mm.
And how is that true in my life?
Mm.
Where have I ever known somebody like that? Where has there been a time where I think I've been like that? How sad is the world that there isn't more of that? And so these poetic literary things can become venues, an opening where the aperture can get wider and wider, and the tears can return again with time. But I think the immediate thing might be most helpful is this idea of how far back would you have to go when it stopped? What was your belief? What was happening at that time? Because it's probably still active.
Mm.
And it's trying to take care of you.
Mm.
And so how to talk to the part that's stopping you, understand the thing, and go to the places that access you. And so those would be some things that might help.
Mm. Thank you, Jim. That's very practical help too. We're just over halfway. So I'm going to take a little pause and just invite everyone who's with us to review the questions and either pop in your own or vote up questions that you'd like Jim to answer. Obviously, we won't be able to get to all the questions. So if you vote on the ones that are there, helps us get the most helpful ones to Jim. We'll just pause for a minute or two. You got your beads, Jim?
I do. Can you hear them? Can you hear them? Oh, yeah. No, I'm sorry. I thought, oh, shh. Oh, I picked up.
No. You should hold them up because we get questions on the podcast. What's that noise?
Yeah. Oh, no. There he goes again. Rosary Swinger. Old Rosary Swinger Jim. Heading down the trail. Oh my gosh! Oh geez! Oh, I'm just used to holding my road. It's a sacramental for me. I'm used to it.
Yeah. No, they sound beautiful once you kind of know what they are.
Yeah.
So I'm glad some people are going to get an opportunity to see them today because obviously,
yes,
podcasts they hear them but they don't know what it is.
Oh my gosh! All right. There you go.
Okay, you ready, Jim?
Mm-hmm.
So this is from an anonymous friend. You are one of my spiritual heroes. I do not have a specific question for you, but I am so grateful to be a part of this Q&A session. Thank you for your contribution to my spiritual life.
No, thank you for that. And I've shared this before, but it's a gift to me. Do you know what I mean? I just, like passing on what's been passed on to me. It seems so profoundly providential to me. So it blesses me to do it. It's so kind of so mysterious, really, the teaching. Yeah. So anyway, but thank you for that. Yeah.
Thanks, Tim. Okay, another one from an anonymous friend. How can one help someone with physical pain without words that might sound superficial? All I know to do is to be still and sit in silence with them, holding their suffering with them.
Well, there's some things to be, first on, depends on what the relationship is, like an elderly parent or a spouse or a close friend or pet, and a sibling, and what the relationship is. There's some things to consider. One is to continue doing what you're doing, because I think there's a nonverbal empathy that's reassuring and conveys itself that they're not alone in their suffering. Some other things to consider is things like this. I can't even begin to imagine what you're going through by this pain. I can tell how painful it is. And because I care about you, it touches me and I want to be here for you. But I realize that I don't know what you're going through. But if ever you want to talk about it, you might not want to. You don't have to. I know it's very personal. But if ever you do want to talk about it, I'd be more than happy to do that. Because sometimes what happens talking about it is sharing it. And sharing it can shed light into it. There's another thing to consider is if all the options have been considered that can help you, maybe they've already been explored in terms of medical options and different kinds of interventions with pain management, mindfulness training, mindfulness work, medications, different whatever. So just to be sure, have all those people that have been helping you with this, are you confident that they're giving you the best possible set of options for you? Or is it possible there's other options you've not considered? And you would see where that might take you also. So I think to just do what you're doing, that's the essence of it, shows that you care. You let them know that you're not pretending to understand. But ever they do want to talk about it. And then also relax. Sometimes when I would work with people that were training to do hospice work, and they were so nervous about being with their first dying patient, I don't know what to say, I won't know what to say. Like training to be a spiritual director too, it's like this. And almost always, they would come in to see me the first time they were with a dying person, and grace gave them to say what to say. There was something about just being there in the presence of the sincerity of the person, like this. And so I think the sensitivities to things like that.
Yeah, that's helpful. It's not everyone can listen to someone's pain. It's like if you can develop ears to listen, that's a gift. Do you think?
Well, you're raising another important point. Is so because I'm a trauma survivor and I worked with trauma. See, if the person is, and they're cathartic, they're sharing the trauma at the feeling level. And if the story of their trauma is in some way similar to mine, I can feel the energies of trauma in me. So I knew I needed to practice with help with supervision, how to interiorly back away to take care of myself. So they would think, for example, I was taking session notes, but I was making out a grocery list, where I was looking over their shoulder out the window, counting the birds on the telephone wire, or touching the rosary in my eyeglass case on my chair. So for their sake and mine. So sometimes you need to interiorly back away to yourself. Imagine something else. Sometimes you can do a ritualistic thing, like taking a finger and pressing into the palm of your hand. Or putting a hand over your stomach. You do things to concretize your separateness from you're with them in love, but you get too drawn into it, you start to get traumatized too, and you're not any help to anybody.
Yeah.
And therefore, and certain people, they need you just to honor what their limits are in exposure to the pain. Some people, it isn't their thing. And sometimes if it's a family member, you have to sort all that out as a family member. But still, you need how to eternally distance yourself from the pain of the family member so you can realistically be there with them so that you don't get flooded. And you're always looking for the middle path. You don't want to stay away completely. I can't go near it. But also you don't want to say, by God, I'm going to go in there and make myself do this. And then you go home and you're throwing up and you can't. So you're always getting help that you need to be there for the one you're trying to help. Yeah. And it's personal. It's things like that. Yeah.
That's really helpful. Thank you. A question from an anonymous friend. How do we prepare children for their inevitable awareness of the suffering of the world while also shielding them from it?
I think, of course, this has to do with developmental stages of children and suffering. So one thing we do as parents, I think, is try to keep our children as safe as possible. We owe them that. Next, we need to not be overly protective in not allowing them to feel their own suffering. So if they fall down and cry, You put your arm around them, oh, darn it, doesn't that hurt? Let's see what we can't do to, or if there's a misunderstanding and they're in the room crying, you go and you sit down the edge of the bed, and, sometimes we all love each other in this house, but sometimes we don't act it. And I'm sorry the way I talked to you, or I didn't mean to do. And, how are things doing at school? And so you can't, if you're overly protective, you're doing them a grave disservice, because they're not internalizing skill sets for boundary setting. They're not internalizing their capacity to feel suffering, be present to the suffering, get help with the suffering. And so if they're ill prepared for it and go out into the world, then they get overwhelmed with all this suffering. So I think it's keeping them as safe as possible. But no, you're doing it in such a way that and also lets them know that you're not invincible either. You need not to overexpose them to your suffering if you're going through a lot, and say there's a marital breakup or different things. You owe it to them not to do that. But you also for them to see you crying, or for them to see you upset, and say, Daddy's upset right now. Mommy's not feeling real good. So it kind of normalizes the rhythms of suffering that go in life and how we respond to it. It would be things along those lines I think are helpful.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's a tough job being a parent.
It is. Another little thought I would say to child psychology: if you start seeing early signs of a child who's hypersensitive to suffering, anxiety, intense reactions to things, the sooner you get them help, the better. Because there's behavioral cognitive strategies and family system strategies to help children more effectively cope with and process suffering and stress and so on. So in some instances, things like that are called for.
Thank you. An anonymous friend asks, "Hi Jim, could you please share a little more on axial moments in regard to healing trauma?"
Yes. First of all, here's the metaphor I'm using as a turning. I'm saying that the axial moment is a moment. I want to apply it to therapy, applies to suffering. The healing process takes place through time. Session follows session. Insight follows insights. Setback follows setback. And you do love's work. You engage in the work. You process it. Then there are certain moments in the therapy where the person pauses. And in a sense, sometimes they just let themselves hear what they just said. It also is very important that the therapist himself or herself be contemplatively grounded, that they empathically can tell that it's happening. Because otherwise, you start showing up in this vulnerable way, and the person you're with doesn't even see it. And so part of the art form, I think, of the clinician is himself or herself to be sensitized to this. Contemplative experience recognizes itself. And then in the pause to say what's happening is the person in the midst of the suffering is in a pause where I say poetically, their very subjectivity is turning on a hidden axis of love-infused presence. And it's dropping down into an abyss-like presence. And usually what happens first is silence. It's like just see when the person's ready to speak, because if you speak too soon, you can break, you don't want to break, you want to let it, and sometimes the tears start to come, sometimes you have to be in tandem with the person. If it goes on for a long time, it might say something like, what's going on? What's happening here? And then what you do is, one of the ways that I put it sometimes is I say to somebody, let's say there's an abusive situation going on in the marriage, emotionally abusive, and let's say that the person's whatever, parent or something. And then I say to the person something like this, say they're having this moment. And I say to the person, the way you are with me right now, this is what your father didn't see in you, or he wouldn't have done to you what he did. The way you're with me right now, this is what your spouse at home doesn't see, or they wouldn't talk to you the way that they do. And I know sometimes we get buried under the rubble of internalized abandonments and trauma. We lose our way, but just look at you now. Really. I feel privileged to be here with you. And I got good news and bad news. The good news, this is real. This is real. This is who you are, and this is who you have a right to be. The bad news is by the time you get halfway home, it'll maybe close off again. But we witnessed it together, and it's true. And little by little by little, you can learn to more habitually stabilize in the sinking the taproot of your heart, in this presence of yourself, to learn to be there for yourself and with yourself. And how do you set boundaries and face what you need to face, do what you need to do, little by little by little. And then you wait till the next time it happens, you do it again. And pretty soon you and the person get used to it until they start to recognize how it's happening at home. Sometimes they wake up in the middle of the night and it was so subtle they didn't see it before. And lying there in the dark, they realize they're in touch with something, or they realize they're being sustained by something, or they realize, like, I matter. I matter. I count. I didn't know that. See, I didn't viscerally know it. And so I think sensitivities like that, I think, are part of this podcast that we're doing. Also, when I finish this memoir, I think it's going to be posted again on the website. I think there's 10 videos I did on this in Madison, Wisconsin, with an extended reading list. There's a shorter version I did with Sounds True with Carolyn Mace, then a much more expanded version, University of Wisconsin, where I walk therapists and hospice workers and AA people and trauma survivors. You get a better, so that's on its way. There's some former students of the Living School that are helping me with that, and so that'll be there. Yes,
and the talks are going up on your website. A set of talks on your 7 steps towards the axial moment, right? You go through.
Exactly. That's what it is.
Yeah.
So there'll be the Teresa of Avila will be there as a course. Yeah. Mystical sobriety is coming up as a course, but this is going to be there. It's not a course. It's just there. Right. Yeah. They can click on it, and then when the book comes out, a bit like that. So it'll be there. Yeah.
Yes, I would say the people at CONSPIRE will likely get a follow-up email with where those talks are. They're not on your website just yet, but I know in the next month they're going to be there. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. Excellent, thank you. Question from Victoria. I have been actively participating in Christian fellowships and Buddhist sanghas for a long time. I find, to my disappointment as a Christian, that Christian fellowships tend not to be as non-judgmental and loving as sanghas. Why would the practice of compassion and empathy differ in these communities?
Well, first of all, I also have been deeply enriched by the Dharma and Dharma practice, and through Thomas Merton I was introduced to it, and it means a great deal to me also. And I find that my Buddhism and my Christianity enrich each other. And so I would put it this way. First of all, be grateful. Compassion is the body of emptiness, the Buddhists say. So be grateful there's a Sangha, where the body of emptiness is manifesting itself. Be grateful. And know that regretfully, in your present Christian company, you're experiencing what all too often happens. And you either have to know that God's infinitely in love with all those people and bear witness. But if it's just too much, leave. See, leave. Sometimes we hang around something that just isn't real anymore. Because there are also very loving, very Christ-like living school. But also locally in parishes in different places, there are very contemplative, very loving, Christ-conscious gatherings. And sometimes you can just find one other person. The contemplative dimensions of discipleship. And I put it to you, when they asked Jesus, what's the greatest commandment? That is all these beautiful things that you say. What's the one thing that if we would align our heart with that, everything else would fall into place? He said, the first commandment is to love God with all your heart, with all your mind. See, be infinitely in love with the infinite love that's infinitely in love with you. This is the first commandment. And your neighbor is yourself. And so you seek out people that breathe that, that have you sense that in them.
Thank you. So Dale is asking, could you please say more about the release of mystical sobriety? So I can say a little bit about that, should I, Jim?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So we've recorded you teaching on mystical sobriety, and we're in the process of packaging it into an online course. It will be like Teresa of Avila, and we'll be launching that next year, I believe.
Good.
So it's a work in progress, but we're very excited about its wonderful content.
Yeah, as always with CAC, it was well done too. I mean, well produced, and I was very pleased. And I think it's in the same chapel where I gave the talk this morning. It was in that same room. Yeah, it was, yeah.
Yeah, we filmed it there.
So it'll be out, yeah.
Yes. Okay, well, here's one. What is the difference between depression and the dark night of the soul? And I will just say, on Turning to the Mystics, we did a whole episode of that with you and Mirabai, talking about depression and dark night of the soul. I think it was a bonus episode, so the last episode we did. So if someone wants to hear that, like a 45-minute discussion on that. But do you just want to touch on that here, Jim?
Just briefly, yes. Here's a simple way to put it, I think, is the symptoms of depression are the vegetative signs are a lack of energy, wanting to sleep all the time, or you can't sleep, loss of appetite, or you're eating all the time, and also feelings of utter isolation, feelings of worthlessness, feelings of hopelessness. So these are some of the signs of depression. It's a mood disorder. So anxiety disorders and depression are the two main mood disorders. They're very common. I think everyone throughout their life sometime has known depression. Depression is different than grieving. One of the things that causes depression is sometimes unprocessed trauma and unprocessed loss, because bereavement has a beginning, a middle, and an end. You integrate the loss into your life. But if it doesn't process this, it gets stuck there as depression. The dark night of the soul is, and John of the Cross's understanding of the dark night, is that in your spiritual life and prayer, you're used to being nurtured by God and consoled by God and insights, as well you should be. But what happens is that God is weaning you off these finite ways of experiencing the infinite presence of God, so that by weaning you off your dependency on these finite ways, God might begin to infuse into your soul an infinite union with the infinite love of God that passes through a dark night. See? And so at first they can feel similar. It's lost. But also a person be going through the dark night, they don't feel depressed at all. Merton once called it a hell of mercy. It is like, it isn't as anything is wrong, as nothing's right. Like there's something missing. And so, but you're energized in the presence of being powerless to resolve the longing. And so they're quite qualitatively different, but they can happen simultaneously. For example, if you're prone to depression, and one of the triggers for depression is unconsummated longing, you could see if you're prone to depression, the grace of the dark night could trigger your depression. So it's a double header. Lucky you. You're a depressed mystic in the and then what you would do is you treat each accordingly. When someone's going through the dark night, you don't give them Prozac for the dark night. If they're major depression, you don't say read John of the Cross, suicide. so what you do is it's where these two realms touch each other. It's very personal. Really, this also has to do with anxiety too. It's the same way where these things just touch each other, and how we work with this kind of incarnate unitive mystery of who we are. And so those would be some thoughts on the distinction.
Yeah, that's helpful, Jim. Thank you. Well, we are coming to the end of our time with you. And just in this last minute, Jim, did you have any final reflections?
No, except once again to express my gratitude for this path of my own life, which has involved channeling this to people, being a teacher like this, God using me in this way. I'm immensely grateful. Grateful to Richard years ago inviting me to give talks at CAC and then with the Living School. And this event right now, the podcast. And just, and also I think a gratitude for the communal sincerity of the participants. Contemplative church, and this, the witness to this like we're responding to a longing, and their response to it bears witness to this in the world. So we look down through the ages and see these contemplative movements throughout the history of religious faith. And now it's our turn. Now it's our turn to feel this longing, to seek it and find it and share it and give it. And so it's an amazing gift. I just feel very, very grateful for it. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Jim. And you help us know that what we seek is real. So I'm so grateful for you. And thank you for this time with the students, with our audience.
Thanks. Thank you. It was lovely. Thanks.